This is a short introduction to what is a concept, intended as a foundational introduction to the idea, to support concept-based teaching and learning. So if you look up a dictionary definition of what a concept is, it says something conceived in the mind. Well, I'm pretty sure everything is conceived in the mind, given it's how we process our experiences. The second idea there is that it's an abstract or generic idea that is generalized from particular instances. And that's a more useful definition to us. We're going to look at some definitions, and then we're going to look at some examples. And hopefully by the end of the video, you'll have a pretty strong understanding of what a concept is and begin to see how that might support teaching and learning. It's worth remembering sort of Nietzsche at this point with his gigantic moustache. And he reminds us that it's hard for a human being to say anything is absolutely true. We invent useful thoughts that help us. We construct things that support us. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to find a sense-making framework that will tell us about what a concept is that we can use to help teaching and learning. We're not looking for some absolute truth about consciousness. So let's look at some work. Lynn Erickson points out that we often teach at the lower level of this diagram here. We teach facts that are found within a topic. And what we want to be doing is drawing out the concepts, those transferable big ideas, or organizing thoughts that will transfer between many different topics and many different instances. And a rough Lynn Erickson definition would read something like that a concept is a mental construct which is timeless, universal, abstract, to differing degrees, represented by one or two words and examples that share common attributes. Pretty useful definition. I tend to think of them as a group or class of objects or phenomena, things that you observe and see, or do, that share critical attributes whilst having many variable attributes. So it's almost like a sort of set theory, that when I use this word or label, it means that the thing I'm labeling has attributes that I perceive. And that's kind of obvious when you look up something like ecosystem on Google. You get these pictures. They don't look like they have a lot in common. The coral reef on the bottom right doesn't seem to have much to do with birds landing on a marsh or a pond, but Google thinks it does. And the reason is because the idea of an ecosystem, all of these have properties that are shared, despite many variable things. These all happen to have water in them, but there's no need for them to have water. Water isn't a critical attribute. Well, the presence of water, but not a body of water. So, a group or a class of objects. So when we're sort of learning about the world or studying something, we want to think about, okay, what mental constructs are we using to organize that knowledge, to dig into it? So if you've been enjoying the TV series The Durrells, produced by BBC, available on international television, then Gerald Durrell's real-life dog, Roger, he did once exist, played by Mossap, a dog actor, he's a proper noun. There's only one Mossap. He exists in one particular place, in one particular time, in one particular context. If we begin to think about that Mossap, or Roger, is a dog, we've already got a concept. Dog is an abstraction from particular examples. All dogs, despite looking very, very different, share certain common attributes. So a huge Great Dane and a tiny Chihuahua share certain attributes that mean they belong to the class of objects called dogs, and that's a common noun, not a proper one, which is just Roger. We could abstract that up a level and we could talk about mammals, and that's even less obvious what the attributes are. What does Roger here share with a mouse is a little bit harder to see, or human. But we can begin to see, okay, warm-blooded, live young, may have fur. So that's an abstraction up. And if you wanted to really abstract up, Gerald Durrell's dog Roger, to him, represented aspects of his freedom within nature. So you could say Roger was an example of the abstract idea of freedom. And you can see we're getting more and more abstract. And we're going from proper nouns, which are not concepts, to common nouns, which are, but can be very trivial, to abstract nouns, which can be very aloof. And we could go down the other way. We could look at Roger's tail and say, well, he has a tail, so let's take a bit of Roger, and we could get a concept out of that. And we could have the common noun of tails, which is a concept. Tails can look very different in different contexts. You could ask if a coccyx is a tail. So, if you're studying, and Roger's one of the things in your topic, you might be studying animal stories, or you might be studying some geopolitical context of the time and looking at Gerald Durrell's book. How do you know what concept to pick? Like, how do you know which one to go in on? And it will very much depend on what your aim is, what your goal is, and what the unit is. There isn't an absolute answer. Going back to Nietzsche, there's only a useful answer. So, if you're doing a unit on freedom, and this is deliberately slightly tongue-in-cheek, you would have maybe Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People from the French Revolution, a personification of freedom. You might look at Nelson Mandela's conception of freedom, and then you might look at Roger as an image of freedom within childhood, and you might try to see this big idea of freedom. What do we mean by it? What are its boundaries? But you could go to the other absurdity, and you could say, well, I'm actually interested in a unit on tails. The more likely thing is you're doing a unit on animal adaptations, or animal forms, and a sort of form function about animal survivals. And you might look at a variety of tails, what they're used for, how they help animals survive. And I would hope you go to a slightly more abstract level of form, function, and how do animal features reflect the way they've adapted to their environment. And then you can always stretch that concept by looking at something like a snake, where, although it has an extended vertebra that goes past, say, its anus and the end of its digestive system, because it doesn't have legs, it's hard to know if that's a tail or not, or whether it's a continuation of its backbone. So again, you could really dig into this idea of an animal adaptation and a tail. And those were the two extremes when we looked at Roger that you could go to, like the sort of smaller level or the very most abstract. Would you ever do a unit on Roger? Well, I really hope not. Because if you learn specific things about that dog, Roger liked to roll in the sun, Roger liked to have his chin tickled, it's really hard to know if that's true of any other object. Like, is that a common attribute of a class of objects, or is that just Roger? Do all dogs like to be tickled? Is that significant? And that's why I would really hope we don't do units on Roger. But often, we do units on Roger. We do a unit on Henry VIII. And it's not immediately clear whether we're studying political power, autocracy, political and spiritual leadership. It's not clear what we're doing. We accumulate facts without naming the concepts which are transferable and those which are just locked in that one particular time, context, culture. I'll give you a real example from my own sort of education. I remember as a child we did a project on Porchester Castle, which is in the south of England, and we went there on a trip and we learnt about Porchester Castle. Virtually the only thing I can remember is that sitting by that moat, I remember watching crabs in it. It's a proper noun. Porchester Castle is just one particular place, and I learnt specific facts about that place. How do I know that I didn't really do any conceptual learning and that this was extremely limiting? Well, firstly, I've never used any of the knowledge from that in any other context. And secondly, when recently talking to a colleague, they pointed out how different Japanese castles look. This is a Meiji Japan Japanese castle or defensive structure. There's nothing that I can transfer from my knowledge of Porchester to this, because I wasn't focusing on a concept with critical attributes that I could make inferences about other examples as just learning one proper noun. So, for example, if I had learnt instead that castles are defensive structures whose form represents the kind of offensive military hardware that the designers anticipated would be used against it, now I've got some really interesting thoughts about, okay, looking at this castle, what can I guess, or what can I infer more effectively, were the weapons that the designers thought would be used against it at the time? What does that tell me about military warfare of the time? What does that tell me about the technology being used in that country at the time? So how does all this happen? How do children, adults, in fact all of us, form mental schema, concepts and understand how to apply them, what they apply to, and where that conceptual knowledge also transfers or relates to. And Piaget is really key here. He had a basic idea which is fabulously good and appears in almost all contemporary learning theories if you read them carefully enough, possibly unwittingly. And his very, very simple idea is that to form a category or a concept or a schema, what we do is we collect examples that consolidate it. So I see a dog, I see another dog, I see another dog. I have some pretty clear criteria about what constitutes a dog. And the more examples of dogs, the more solid that schema gets. The more different examples of castles I see, from Japan to Mali to South Africa to sort of Inuit defensive structures, the more I can consolidate my mental schema. That's half the story, and that's what we do in class a lot, and that's assimilation. And then the other thing we do is accommodation, that sometimes you come across examples which are so challenging that we have to rethink our definition. So mammals seems fairly, has certain forms, has live young, and then you hit a platypus or an echidna, and then you sort of really have struggles about your classifications. Or even just maybe you've never seen a whale or a dolphin. And so in your mind, mammals were always these furry land-based things, which isn't a critical attribute. And you see a whale and suddenly realize, actually, some of the things I thought were critical attributes aren't. They're in fact variable. So this is the basic process which you want to scaffold in class. Children extrapolating from multiple examples what the common attributes are, forming definitions, testing them out, and then challenging those on the more subtle or difficult cases as they get older and as they develop. If that sounds familiar, well, it should be, because that criterion-based thinking is the same as critical thinking. And if you read Socrates' dialogues recorded by Plato, they're basically that. So a brave man would take reckless acts in battle. What if someone were drunk in battle and made a reckless act? Does that make them brave if they're drunk? Things like that. And Socrates would probe these ideas, trying to find out what are the criteria to qualify for justice, for goodness, He tended to do it only for very abstract qualities, but as learners, we're also interested in what does make an ecosystem, and how do we understand it, and what inferences we can make. Even an animal adaptation like a tail, how do we understand the idea of animal adaptations? So whilst critical thinking tends to sit at the very abstract level, we're also interested in very everyday disciplinary concepts that Lynn Erickson might call micro-concepts. So Lynn Erickson provides us with a really effective diagram to represent this that we can dig into. And hopefully this has clarified a little bit about not just Lynn Erickson, but in general in educational terms when we talk about concepts. And I think there's a very similar word for things like schema. What exactly do we mean? The following videos will dig into a range of areas, and one of the most significant is we don't just have concepts, as Lynn Erickson's diagram indicates, we have generalizations. So for example, we have animal adaptations reflect their needs and wants and the environment in which they inhabit. And you might say, well, what do we mean by a need versus a want? And normally, principles, generalizations, our conceptual understandings in our context represent a relationship between two concepts, and that's next.